Welcome, everyone, to a brand new deep dive. We have an incredibly dense, really thought-provoking syllabus to get through today. But before we jump into the material, I need to ask a quick favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the show right now so you never miss a deep dive with us.
Yeah, it truly makes a difference. It allows us to keep analyzing these complex, multi-layered subjects for you.
Absolutely. So today we are dissecting an immensely compelling ebook. It's titled Survival Guide, Preparing for Uncertainty, and it's authored by Conrad Riker, copyrighted in 2024.
Right.
And for those of you listening who are focused on building true self-reliance, you are absolutely going to want to purchase this manual. You can find it right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And you should also definitely follow the author to stay updated on his ongoing research. His handle on Substack is @ConradRiker.
Right, @ConradRiker. Because Riker's work is not your standard apocalyptic fiction. It's a highly analytical, really stoic examination of modern infrastructure and human psychology.
Exactly. And to give you context on the specific demographic Riker is addressing, he explicitly states right in the introduction that this guide is written for the red-pilled rational man.
Yeah, let's unpack what he means by that specific terminology, right? Because it really sets the entire tone for the book.
It does.
When Riker uses the term red-pilled, obviously borrowing from that famous Matrix analogy, he is speaking to a manosphere demographic that feels completely disillusioned with modern institutions.
Yeah, he's writing directly to men who are tired of depending on what they view as unreliable, fragile, top-down authorities. The target reader here is someone who wants to take absolute, uncompromising control of his own destiny.
Right, stepping away from a system that essentially overpromises and underdelivers before they were captured by, specific ideological frameworks.
And we really need to state our parameters for this discussion right at the top.
Oh, definitely.
Riker's manual touches on highly charged themes. We're talking global gun laws, the Second Amendment, the total collapse of the rule of law, and the stark realities of the manosphere and modern survivalism.
Yeah, and our role here is strictly neutral.
Completely neutral. We are not endorsing any political ideology, taking sides on these cultural debates, or prescribing a specific worldview.
Right. Our job is just to act as impartial, enthusiastic guides through Riker's source material, breaking down his historical data, his survival strategies, and the intense ethical dilemmas he poses, so you can evaluate the architecture of his arguments for yourself.
Exactly. So, with the mission locked in, let's start where Riker starts, which is the illusion of permanence.
Yeah, Conrad Riker believes the modern world is profoundly vulnerable. He spends chapter 1 systematically deconstructing the invisible safety nets we just take for granted.
We absolutely take them for granted.
He challenges the reader to look at a normal day. You flip a switch, the lights come on. Yeah. You turn a tap pot, potable water flows out. You drive on paved roads governed by traffic algorithms.
Right.
We assume these interconnected systems, the power grid, the transit network, healthcare allying, we assume they're immutable facts of life. But Riker argues they are incredibly thin layers of ice over a very deep, very cold lake.
And the historical evidence he provides to prove the thinness of that ice is pretty sobering. He doesn't look at, hypothetical asteroid strikes. He looks at the mundane failures that cause catastrophic cascades.
Give us an example.
Take the massive 2003 blackout in the northeastern United States and parts of Canada. Most people remember the imagery of millions of people walking over the Brooklyn Bridge, but Riker zeroes in on the root cause.
Right.
Do you know what brought down a grid that 50 million people relied on? A software bug in an alarm system at a control room in Ohio, and a single overgrown tree branch.
A single tree branch. I mean, that is staggering.
It is. A high-voltage power line sagged into an unpruned tree. Because the alarm system failed, the operators didn't know the line tripped. The electrical load automatically shifted to other transmission lines, overloading them.
And then they heat up.
Exactly. They heated up, they sagged into more trees, and they tripped. Within a span of a few hours, this localized fault caused a cascading failure across more than 100 power plants.
Riker uses that specific example to highlight the terrifying nature of complex, tightly coupled systems. You can be sitting in a high-rise in Manhattan, completely reliant on the electronic locks on your doors, the electric pumps delivering water to your floor, the refrigerated supply chains.
Yeah.
And all that infrastructure can vanish instantly because of a physical interaction with a piece of timber in the Midwest.
Right, and he expands this concept to global transit, too. In 2010, the Eyjafjallajökull volcano in Iceland erupted. In the grand scheme of geological events, it wasn't a massive eruption. but it released an ash cloud directly into the transatlantic flight paths.
Grounding everything.
Everything. Riker analyzes how this completely paralyzed the global just-in-time supply chain. The modern economy doesn't warehouse vast amounts of goods anymore. It relies on continuous, uninterrupted transit. When those millions of flights were grounded, we saw immediate cascading shortages in medical supplies, perishable foods, and manufacturing components worldwide.
He also looks at the healthcare sector through the lens of the 2017 hurricane season in Puerto Rico. When Hurricane Maria hit, the physical destruction was terrible, obviously. But Riker focuses on the logistical collapse.
The invisible systems.
Right, hospitals lost grid power, backup generators failed because the roads were destroyed, meaning diesel fuel couldn't be delivered. The cold chain, the continuous refrigeration required for critical medicines like insulin and vaccines, it broke down entirely. The medical system didn't just struggle, it ceased to exist as a functional entity.
Which brings Riker to his primary thesis for the rational man. The missing component in modern preparedness isn't tactical gear. You can buy all the freeze-dried food and water filters on the market. The critical vulnerability is cognitive. It is the psychological fortress required to withstand the shock when normalcy bias shatters.
Normalcy bias, let's define that because it's crucial. Normalcy bias is the psychological mechanism where the brain assumes that because a disaster has never happened to you, it never will happen to you.
Precisely. And he tackles the social friction of overcoming that bias in Chapter 10, specifically the stigma associated with being a prepper. Because the reality is, if you start stockpiling resources, a lot of society is going to view you as a paranoid outlier.
Yeah, you become the weird guy on the block. But Riker frames this brilliantly by comparing preparedness to the logic of purchasing car insurance.
I love this analogy.
Right. You don't pay car insurance premiums because you are actively planning to drive your vehicle into a concrete barrier. You pay them because you have made a rational statistical calculation regarding the risks of operating a vehicle. Prepping is simply that exact same actuarial logic applied to the macro vulnerabilities of the world.
He illustrates this with the archetype of Noah building the ark. Looking at this purely as a historical or literary metaphor, Noah is the ultimate isolated prepper. He dedicates massive amounts of time, physical labor, and capital to build a massive vessel on dry land based on a catastrophic forecast.
And everyone thinks he's insane.
Exactly. The societal reaction is exactly what you would expect: mockery, ostracization, and disbelief. He becomes a social pariah for preparing for a reality his neighbors cannot comprehend. Yet, his rigid adherence to his rational assessment is what ultimately ensures his family's survival.
It's a powerful parallel for the manosphere demographic Riker is writing for. He acknowledges that adopting this red-pilled view of systemic fragility guarantees you will face pushback from friends, family, or colleagues who don't share this mindset. The people often referred to in these circles as normies.
But let me push back on Riker's proposed solution to this, though. If the premise of prepping is inherently about recognizing that the masses are unprepared and the system is going to fail, doesn't that naturally lead to isolation? How do you build a bridge with a neighbor who thinks you're out of your mind for hoarding water purification tablets?
That is the exact trap Riker warns against. He argues that complete isolation is a tactical error. If you rely on fear-mongering, if you try to scare people into seeing the world your way by shouting about the collapse of society, they will immediately raise their psychological defenses and dismiss you.
Right. Nobody wants to be yelled at about the end of the world.
Exactly. So instead, Riker advocates for a highly calculated approach rooted in empathy and relatable historical precedents.
So instead of talking about the total collapse of the global order, you talk about localized, undeniable events.
Precisely. You reference the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. You point out that tens of thousands of citizens were left without state support, trapped without potable water for days. You rationally explain that keeping a 2-week supply of water and dry goods isn't a sign of paranoia. It is a basic civic responsibility to ensure you don't become a burden on emergency services during a regional crisis.
That's a great angle. You create a dialogue based on historical facts, establishing a bridge of understanding without demanding they completely adopt your worldview.
It's about optics and tactical communication. You don't need them to build their own ark. You just need them to respect why you have lumber in your garage.
But acknowledging this mental shift is only the first phase. In part 2 of his manual, Riker pivots aggressively from the psychological to the physical. Because, as he notes, mental preparation is entirely useless if your body gives out on a 14th floor stairwell when the elevators stop working.
That's a grim image, but very true. Riker titles Chapter 3 The Individual Fortress, and he treats physical fitness as the indispensable foundation of a skyscraper.
And he completely dismisses the aesthetic focus of modern gym culture. For the rational survivor, a low body fat percentage or massive bicep peaks are irrelevant. He is focused entirely on functional capability.
He breaks this down into very specific modalities. He emphasizes Zone 2 cardiovascular training to build an immense aerobic base. This allows you to move continuously for hours without hitting exhaustion.
And rocking.
Yes, rocking. Carrying heavy weighted packs over uneven terrain. Because if the transit grid fails, your primary mode of transporting resources is your own spine and legs. He focuses on tactical strength and flexibility. The literal ability to pull your own body weight over an obstacle, sprint out of a hazardous environment, or physically dominate a threat to your family.
And he directly links that physical capacity to cognitive function under extreme stress in Chapter 4, which covers situational awareness. Having the physical stamina to run is meaningless if your brain freezes and you don't know where to run. Riker dives deep into the physiology of fear. When a sudden catastrophic event occurs, the human body experiences a massive dump of cortisol and adrenaline. The sympathetic nervous system takes over.
Fight or flight.
Exactly. You experience auditory exclusion, where you literally cannot hear what is happening around you. You experience tunnel vision, where your peripheral sight vanishes. Your fine motor skills degrade.
To counter this, Riker breaks down the mechanics of the O-Day loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. It's a concept originally developed by military fighter pilots.
And he uses one of the most remarkable examples of modern history to illustrate mastering this loop. Captain Sullenberger landing U.S. Airways Flight 1549 on the freezing Hudson River in 2009.
It is the pinnacle case study of bypassing the amygdala's panic response. When the plane struck the flock of geese and lost thrust in both engines at a low altitude over a densely populated area, the biological imperative of the passengers and crew was pure panic.
Pure terror.
But Sullenberger utilized tactical breathing and extreme cognitive compartmentalization. He forced his brain to stay in the logical, analytical prefrontal cortex. He rapidly observed his altitude and airspeed, oriented himself to the lack of viable runways, made the highly irregular decision to use the river, and acted with precise motor control.
Riker uses Sully to prove that survival isn't just possessing a mental checklist of actions. It's having the trained neurological pathways to execute those actions when every cell in your body is screaming at you to freeze.
And that specific requirement for absolute, ice-cold, rational control transitions us into Chapter 5, which is arguably the most intense and complex section of the entire book, firearms and self-defense.
This is a chapter where Riker places an immense, almost crushing weight of responsibility on the reader. He begins with a macro analysis of global firearms law, noting that in the majority of the world, access to a firearm is an extreme privilege tightly controlled by the state.
But in the United States, it is protected as a constitutional right under the Second Amendment.
Right. But Riker does not treat this as a simple rallying cry to stockpile weapons. He takes a deeply stoic, philosophical approach to the reality of lethal force.
He makes it abundantly clear to his target audience. A firearm is a profound legal and moral liability. It is the power to end human life instantly, and treating it lightly is the antithesis of the rational man.
He illustrates the razor-thin margins of this liability by contrasting two highly specific legal cases. First, he dissects the 2012 case of George Zimmerman.
Now, to be clear, Riker doesn't analyze the politics of the case.
No, strictly the legal mechanics. He looks at self-defense, duty of retreat, and stand-your-ground statutes. The Zimmerman case became a massive, polarizing national circus, specifically because the legal definition of the initial aggressor and the threshold for fearing imminent bodily harm are incredibly ambiguous in chaotic real-world scenarios.
Yeah, even though Zimmerman was legally acquitted, his life was completely dismantled by civil litigation, media scrutiny, and permanent public infamy.
Exactly. To show how easily a gun owner can cross the line from defense to criminality, he then brings up a 2017 case involving a citizen named Michael Strahan. Not the television personality, but a local resident involved in a neighborhood dispute.
Right. In that instance, the individual brought a firearm into an escalating verbal argument, not discharging it, but using it purely for intimidation. Riker uses this to explain the legal concept of brandishing.
And the result was severe. A felony conviction, prison time, and the permanent revocation of the individual's Second Amendment rights. Raker hammers home that ignorance of the specific legal statutes in your jurisdiction, understanding exactly when the law allows for the presentation of lethal force versus the discharge of lethal force, is a fatal flaw.
And beyond the legal labyrinth, Riker forces the reader to confront the profound psychological toll. He presents a detailed hypothetical case study involving a man he names Alex. Alex is a software engineer, completely average, living in a quiet suburb. One night, his home is breached by armed intruders. Alex retrieves his legally owned firearm, encounters the threat, and in a fraction of a second decides to pull the trigger, neutralizing the intruders and ending their lives.
Raker forces the reader to sit in the uncomfortable aftermath of that scenario. Let us assume Alex is 100% legally justified under his state's castle doctrine. He faces no criminal charges. Riker points out that Alex's life is still irrevocably altered.
Completely shattered.
The psychological weight of taking a human life, the potential for severe post-traumatic stress disorder, the massive financial drain of defending against inevitable wrongful death civil suits filed by the intruders' families, and the social alienation from neighbors who are uncomfortable living next to a man who killed someone.
Riker's ultimate warning here is severe. He argues that irresponsible, emotionally driven gun owners give the entire community a bad name and validate the arguments of those seeking to disarm the populace. The rational man must operate at a much higher standard of emotional regulation and legal knowledge. The power of life and death is a burden, not a toy.
And that brutal reality of navigating threats leads directly into Riker's extrapolations in Chapter 15 regarding urban survival. We've established the individual fortress, fitness, situational awareness, and defensive capability. But Riker asks the reader to fundamentally alter how they view their environment.
When the grid fails and supply chains halt, a modern city ceases to be a center of commerce. It transforms into a concrete landscape for scavenging.
The paradigm shift here is fascinating. Riker points out that you have to stop looking at buildings based on their societal function and start looking at them based on their structural engineering and resource density.
Like the library example.
Exactly. A multi-story public library isn't just a place for books. It is a heavily reinforced structure built to withstand massive weight loads, making it an ideal defensive shelter. More importantly, it is a repository for physical maps, medical textbooks, and structural blueprints of the city, information that becomes priceless when the internet goes dark.
He also notes that large commercial buildings often have massive hidden reservoirs of water in their plumbing systems and rooftop HVAC chillers long after the municipal taps run dry.
But scavenging inside an abandoned structure is merely a logistical challenge. Scavenging in a city populated by desperate, starving individuals is a completely different reality. This brings us to a core tenet of Riker's Manual, Part 3, Societal Fracture and the Lawless Landscape.
In Chapter 18, Riker explores the terrifying mechanics of surviving without the rule of law. He uses a highly relatable analogy to explain how social contracts dissolve. He asks the reader to imagine a casual, pickup game of football at a public park. There are no official referees. The rules are generally understood by all the players, but because there is no enforcement authority, those rules are flexible. They're open to negotiation.
And inevitably, the rules begin to bend in favor of whoever is the largest, the most aggressive, or the loudest player on the field.
Right. Now scale that pickup game up to an entire metropolitan area and replace a football with the daily desperate struggle for potable water, caloric intake, and secure shelter. That is what a lawless society looks like.
Riker relies on historical blueprints to prove this. He deeply analyzes the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. When that massive, deeply centralized state apparatus disintegrated, the transition wasn't peaceful. It was marked by hyperinflation that wiped out life savings overnight, the total vanishing of reliable state police forces.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. That led to the immediate rise of the Bratva, the Russian mafia, who stepped in to fill the power vacuum by running brutal protection rackets and controlling the barter economy.
He also looks at the American Wild West as a prime example of an institutional vacuum. When you have populations expanding faster than the reach of federal courts or law enforcement, disputes over resources aren't settled by litigation. They are settled by raw violence. You see the rise of private security forces like the Pinkertons and the normalization of extrajudicial vigilance committees handing out lynchings. When the referee leaves the field, the entity capable of projecting the most organized force dictates the law.
Which brings up a critical logistical question. How quickly does this happen? Does the power grid fail on a Monday morning, and by Tuesday evening we are living in a violent apocalyptic wasteland?
To answer this, Riker incorporates the sociological research of Dr. Hans-Peter Schreiner in Chapter 17, focusing on man-made disasters and societal breakdown metrics.
And Schreiner's data is genuinely surprising, isn't it? Because the assumption in a lot of survivalist circles is that society instantly fractures the moment the lights go out.
Right. Complete purge mode instantly.
But Schreiner's research indicates that complete social breakdown is rarely instantaneous. It is a slow, agonizing burn. Riker and Schreiner both utilize the timeline of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans as the prime case study. In the immediate 48 to 72 hours following the hurricane's landfall, human nature actually skewed heavily toward cooperation and altruism.
You had countless localized stories of heroism, neighbors rescuing neighbors from flooded rooftops, communities pooling their dry food reserves, a palpable sense of shared endurance in the face of a natural catastrophe.
But the critical variable was the expectation of rescue. They were cooperating because they assumed the cavalry was coming.
Exactly. The timeline of decay is tied directly to the realization of abandonment. As the days dragged into a week and the heat index rose, the realities of severe dehydration and starvation began to override the social contract. The local police force suffered massive desertions, and their communication networks failed when their radio batteries died.
The Superdome, intended as a shelter of last resort, became a nightmare of overcrowding, violence, and zero sanitation.
It was only when the population realized that the top-down system had completely failed them that desperation replaced cooperation. That is when the rampant, organized looting of electronics and firearms began, and the city descended into martial chaos.
So the tactical question for you, the listener, is how do you survive that specific slow burn? If the social contract is dissolving around you in real time, rigidity will get you killed. According to Riker, the ultimate survival trait in a lawless zone is immense situational fluidity.
Survivors are not necessarily the individuals with the largest stockpiles of ammunition. They are the individuals who possess the psychological agility to read rapidly shifting environmental dynamics. They understand the tactical necessity of assuming a gray man persona.
Blending in.
Yes, blending in, projecting zero wealth or resources, and laying low to avoid drawing the attention of organized raiders. Conversely, they also know the exact moment when they must assert absolute, uncompromising authority to defend their perimeter. And, perhaps most importantly, they understand the mechanics of negotiation and barter in a zero-trust environment.
Riker backs this up with an incredible historical analysis in Chapter 22, focusing on the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. The initial tremor occurred before dawn, destroying the city's water mains. The subsequent fires raged for days, utterly destroying the commercial and residential districts. The city was thrust into immediate martial law, with General Frederick Funston deploying federal troops with orders to shoot looters on sight.
The historical accounts Riker highlights focus on the dichotomy of the citizenry. The vast majority, possessing zero mental preparation for such an event, were paralyzed by normalcy bias. They floundered, attempting to salvage useless material possessions while the fire lines advanced.
But a small minority of the population, individuals who possessed the mental fortitude to immediately accept the new brutal reality, became anchors of order.
They rapidly organized fire breaks, established makeshift triage centers, and adapted to the chaos instead of being consumed by it. They maintained their agency because they had already fought the psychological battle beforehand.
And navigating that chaos leads us directly into what is undeniably the darkest, most agonizing portion of Riker's entire philosophy. It brings us to part 4 of our analysis, the ultimate crucible, which covers ethics, morality, and human nature.
In Chapter 9, Riker forces the reader to abandon the comfort of abstract philosophy and confront the brutal mathematics of survival ethics. He constructs a chilling, highly plausible scenario. You are deep into a grid-down, disaster scenario. There is no infrastructure, no communication, and absolutely no expectation of external rescue.
You manage to secure a localized warehouse containing a finite amount of life-saving resources: medical kits, antibiotics, and clean water.
The catastrophic catch is that there are multiple survivors in your immediate vicinity, and the resources are mathematically insufficient to save everyone. Who receives the resources? Who lives? And who is condemned to die?
It is an agonizing dilemma, and Riker doesn't offer a comforting answer. To understand how professionals handle this, he analyzes the protocols of medical triage, citing specific frameworks published in the Journal of Medical Ethics.
He breaks down the START method: simple triage and rapid treatment. In a mass casualty event where medical personnel and supplies are overwhelmed, the ethical consensus completely shifts away from equality of care. Medical professionals use a brutal tagging system.
They do not allocate the scarce antibiotics or surgical time to the individuals who are the most severely injured because the probability of their survival is too low. It would be a waste of resources.
They prioritize the individuals categorized as yellow or delayed, those who are severely injured but possess the biological strength to actually recover if given the resources.
It's the cold utilitarian logic of prioritizing viability over compassion. And Riker uses that to ask a much broader, deeply unsettling question about human nature. When the pressure of starvation and resource depletion reaches its absolute apex, do we maintain our societal norms or do we cross the taboo line?
He does not shy away from the darkest depths of history to explore this. He brings up the infamous Donner Party of 1846. This was a group of American pioneers, fundamentally normal people, who became snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains after taking an unproven route called the Hastings Cutoff.
Riker details the physiological reality of what happened to them. As their caloric intake dropped to zero, their bodies began consuming their own muscle mass. The social cohesion of the wagon train fractured completely as the leadership of George Donner proved ineffective.
And eventually, they crossed the ultimate societal taboo. Trapped in what became known as the Camp of Death, starving members of the party resorted to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of those who had already succumbed to the elements.
Riker poses a haunting philosophical question to the reader regarding the Donner Party. Did they actually possess free will in that moment? Was the act of cannibalism a profound crime against human dignity, or was it a desperate, tragically justifiable biological necessity dictated by the primal imperative to survive? Riker uses this to illustrate that our concepts of morality are heavily dependent on the luxury of a full stomach.
And it isn't just about extreme caloric deprivation. Riker is deeply interested in how the mere absence of authority rapidly mutates human behavior. To illustrate this, he dives into the mechanics of Philip Zimbardo's 1971 Stanford prison experiment.
This is a critical study for understanding systemic versus dispositional behavior. Zimbardo took completely normal, psychologically healthy college students and randomly assigned them to the roles of either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment in the basement of the psychology building. The results were terrifying.
Within days, the students assigned as guards experienced de-individuation. They adopted sadistic, abusive, and authoritarian behaviors. The students assigned as prisoners adopted submissive, depressive, and completely compliant behaviors.
The psychological abuse escalated so rapidly that Zimbardo had to terminate the 2-week experiment after only 6 days. Riker uses this to prove how dangerously fast human beings will adopt tyrannical or subservient roles the moment standard societal structures and accountability are removed.
And we don't have to look at extreme historical examples from 1846 or 1971 to see this mechanism in action. Riker brings this analysis directly into the modern era by examining the psychological phenomenon of resource hoarding during the initial outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic.
The toilet paper riots.
Exactly, but Riker views it through the lens of game theory, specifically the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma. We saw individuals completely clearing out supermarket shelves, hoarding years' worth of basic sanitization goods and non-perishables, completely depriving their immediate neighbors of basic necessities.
Riker asks the reader to objectively analyze that behavior. Was that a justifiable, rational survival instinct, the primary imperative of a man securing his family's safety at all costs? Or was it an unjustifiable manifestation of pure selfishness that actively accelerated the degradation of the community? The line between rational preparation and destructive hoarding blurs incredibly fast when fear is the primary motivator.
Which forces the rational, prepared listener into the ultimate ethical corner. This is the hardest question Riker asks in the entire book. Let's assume you followed his blueprint perfectly. You hardened your mind against normalcy bias. You built your individual physical fortress. You secured your resources. And now the catastrophic event has occurred. The grid is down and the supply chains are dead.
What is your ethical obligation to the normies? What is your responsibility to the neighbors who mocked you for building your ark and who are now knocking on your reinforced door, starving?
Riker views this dilemma as a macro-scale manifestation of the bystander effect. He invokes the tragic historical narrative of Kitty Genovese, a woman who was brutally murdered outside her apartment in Queens, New York. According to the foundational reports that shaped psychological theory for decades, dozens of witnesses saw or heard portions of the attack from their windows, yet no one intervened or called the authorities because the diffusion of responsibility led each witness to assume someone else would take action.
Riker's warning is chilling. In a true grid-down survival scenario, there is no someone else. There is no 911 dispatcher. There are no state authorities coming to intervene. It is entirely on you.
So, the dilemma is stark. Do you open your drawer, diluting your carefully calculated finite resources among the unprepared, thereby statistically decreasing the survival probability of your own family? Or do you embrace the cold triage logic we discussed earlier, lock your doors, and force the unprepared to suffer the lethal consequences of their own lack of foresight?
Riker refuses to provide a neat, comforting answer because there simply isn't one. The core takeaway from Chapter 9 is that survival isn't just about keeping your heart beating, it is about the immense psychological toll of having to live with the choices you made to keep it beating. Surviving the collapse might cost you your humanity.
But Raker does not end the book in that dark abyss. He transitions from the brutal realities of the Crucible into a deeply philosophical examination of how humanity actually endures. This brings us to the final section of our analysis. Part 5, Rebuilding, Attitude, Hope, and the Survival Community.
If the overarching goal is extreme self-reliance, it seems counterintuitive. But Riker argues that the most potent tool in the rational man's arsenal isn't a firearm, a water filter, or a reinforced bunker. It is relentless, weaponized optimism.
In Chapter 21, Riker presents a profound inversion of modern psychological theory. We are all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which posits that a human being must secure their baseline physiological safety, food, water, shelter, before they can even begin to focus on higher psychological needs or self-actualization. Riker argues that in an extreme survival scenario, that pyramid completely flips.
If you do not possess a fierce, optimistic will to live, you will succumb to apathy and fail to perform the basic tasks required to secure the food and water.
He provides incredible historical receipts to demonstrate optimism as a tangible, mechanical tool. He analyzes the 1960 maritime disaster known as the Miracle of Virtue. Captain John Caldwell and his crew were shipwrecked and left adrift in a small boat in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean for an astonishing 141 days.
They did not survive solely through nautical skill. They survived because Caldwell recognized that despair was deadlier than starvation. He instituted rigid routines and fostered an environment of uncompromising, aggressive optimism that prevented the crew from turning on each other or giving up.
He also provides a deeply granular analysis of the 2010 Copiapó mining accident, where 33 Chilean miners were trapped deep underground following a catastrophic cave-in. They were entombed for 69 days in crushing heat and darkness, unaware for weeks if the surface even knew they were alive.
Riker focuses on the leadership of Mario Sepulveda, who became the psychological anchor of the group. Sepulveda didn't just ration the meager tuna and milk supplies, he actively managed the psychological environment. He organized daily prayers, forced the men to maintain a strict routine to preserve their circadian rhythms in total darkness, and constantly aggressively reinforced the absolute certainty that they would be rescued.
Optimism isn't presented as a passive, feel-good emotion. Riker frames it as a vital psychological shield against the crushing weight of uncertainty. And that specific brand of resilient optimism is the necessary foundation for the final, and perhaps most surprising, paradox of Riker's entire survival philosophy.
Yes. Throughout the book, Riker speaks directly to the manosphere's desire for radical independence. Building the individual fortress, mastering solitary skills, depending on no one. Yet, in Chapter 23, he reveals that the ultimate logical evolution of the truly self-reliant man is the strategic construction of a community.
I think his phrasing perfectly encapsulates the mindset. 2 is coincidence, 3 is a pattern. If you are surviving alone in the woods, you are highly vulnerable. A sprained ankle or a bad case of dysentery is a death sentence. If you partner with one other person, your odds improve, but it might just be situational luck. However, if you possess the leadership and tactical acumen to assemble a cohesive group of 3 or more highly capable individuals, you are no longer just surviving. You have established a pattern. You have planted the absolute foundational seeds of a new society.
Riker stresses that this community cannot be a monolith. A group consisting entirely of heavily armed tactical experts is fundamentally unbalanced and doomed to fail over a long timeline. True resilience requires a massive diversity of complementary skills.
Right, you might be an expert in perimeter defense and marksmanship, but when a member of your group suffers a severe laceration that becomes infected, your rifle is useless. You require the specific knowledge of a medical professional. When your localized water filtration system suffers a mechanical failure, you require the specific analytical skills of an engineer. When the scavenged supplies inevitably run dry, you require the deep generational knowledge of an agriculturalist.
So if the goal is to build this diverse, high-functioning group, how do you prevent it from devolving into the authoritarian nightmare of the Stanford prison experiment we discussed earlier? How do you maintain social cohesion without a central government to enforce the laws?
To answer that, Riker studies insular groups that have historically endured through immense isolation and shared purpose. He conducts a fascinating sociological deep dive into the Amish. The Amish have survived for centuries in tightly knit, completely interdependent communities by adhering to the Ordnung. The Ordnung is not a codified book of state laws backed by a police force. It is a highly complex set of unwritten rules, shared values, and mutual expectations that manage disputes, dictate labor division, and maintain intense social cohesion through a deep sense of shared identity and mutual reliance.
He also examines the historical architecture of the early Israeli kibbutz movement. These were highly isolated, highly vulnerable agricultural settlements that relied entirely on collective survival. Riker focuses on their systems of shared responsibility, where every member performed rotating physical labor, and critical decisions regarding resource allocation and defense perimeters were made collectively.
The takeaway Riker offers the rational man is that in a post-collapse environment, the soft skills of conflict resolution, diplomacy, and community organization are mathematically just as vital to long-term survival as the hard skills of marksmanship and foraging. The lone wolf dies of starvation or exposure. The pack survives.
It really brings the entire philosophy full circle. You begin the journey by recognizing the fragility of the macro system and pulling away from it. You dedicate immense energy to building yourself into an unbreakable, stoic individual capable of extreme violence if necessary. But you do all of that only to realize that your ultimate, highest purpose is to utilize that acquired strength to forge a brand new, vastly more resilient micro-society.
He concludes the manual beautifully with a quote from the philosopher Albert Camus. In the depth of winter, I finally learned that there was in me an unbeatable summer. Riker's ultimate message is that surviving the physical collapse of the grid is only half the battle. Maintaining your humanity, your capacity for cooperation, and your unrelenting drive to build amidst the ashes, that is the true victory over uncertainty.
It is an incredibly dense, demanding, and ultimately empowering framework for anyone seeking to reclaim their agency in an unpredictable world.
So let's briefly recap the immense terrain Conrad Riker covered in this manual. We began by shattering normalcy bias and analyzing the terrifying fragility of the modern grid, looking at the cascades of the 2003 blackout and Katrina. We examined the rigorous physical and cognitive requirements of the individual fortress, from rucking to mastering the O'Day loop under extreme stress. We navigated the treacherous legal and moral liabilities of firearms and lethal self-defense. We confronted the slow, agonizing timeline of societal collapse and the brutal utilitarian math of medical triage. And finally, we discovered that the true endgame of the rational survivor is the optimistic, strategic rebuilding of community.
It is a profound blueprint. But as we conclude our analysis today, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, highly provocative thought to explore on your own. We have spent this entire deep dive discussing the mechanics of surviving the fall, the psychological weight of the crucible, and the necessity of building a new community.
Let's hear it.
Let's take Riker's premise and push it one step further into the timeline. Let's assume you survive. You navigate the collapse, you secure your perimeter, and you successfully gather a capable group of survivors. If the true test of the rational, red-pilled man isn't just surviving the chaos, but acting as the architect of a new paradigm, what is the very first rule, or the very first institution you would establish on day one of that new society? When the slate of the world is completely wiped clean and you are holding the pen, what is the absolute bedrock principle you choose to build humanity back upon?
That is a staggering question, and answering it requires a deep understanding of everything we've discussed today. If you want to arm yourself with the knowledge to even begin grappling with those concepts, you must read this book. Go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to purchase Survival Guide, Preparing for Uncertainty by Conrad Riker.
And once you have digested the material, please honor Riker's request in his epilogue by leaving a 5-star review on the platform to help ensure this critical information reaches others who need it.
Absolutely. Make sure you also follow the author at Conrad N. Riker on Substack to be plugged into his latest analyses. And finally, if you found value in our breakdown today, please hit the like button and subscribe to this show so you never miss another deep dive into the ideas that matter. Thank you so much for joining us in the trenches today. Stay stoic, stay prepared, and we will see you next time.
Goodbye, and stay vigilant.